but we wanted to get a real traditional Catholic perspective on that and what you thought of his legacy, Benedict XVI and his legacy. They refer to Benedict as the preeminent conservative thinker and leader in the Catholic Church. So, Father, as a traditional Catholic, what kind of legacy do you think Benedict XVI left? Is it true that he was this kind of great guiding light for conservative Catholics? Is there any truth to that?
No, there's no truth to it whatsoever. Benedict was not as radical as Francis. Even Benedict himself, before he was elected the Supreme Pontiff of the Novus Ordo in the year 2005, even he responded to a question about why he could be considered conservative, answered that, well, at the time of Vatican II, he was considered quite radical. It's just that everything had become much more liberal or more radical in the meantime than he was. And so that the modernists kind of passed him by. He had become, in a sense, kind of passé and relatively conservative. You know, we have to remember the facts of the matter. Joseph Ratzinger, as a priest and a modernist bishop and a modernist cardinal, was one of the leaders of Vatican II. I mean, he was one of the radicals at Vatican II with Karl Rahner and Herring and the rest of them who were pushing for changes. They were change agents. They were modernists. And, you know, he himself expressed wonderment at how liberal and modernist things had become and basically passed him by. When he was chosen as the Supreme Pontiff of the Novus Ordo back in 2005, he actually asked for prayers that he would not succumb to the wolves, which was kind of an interesting statement at the time. And less than 8 years later, he resigned. And the statements he made then, he resigned on February 28th in the year, 2013, and set the stage for the choice of Francis as his successor, Jorge Bergoglio, who was chosen in March, the next month. Of course, the rest is history. We see what Francis has brought into the Novus Ordo and made of it. In a little less than 8 years, Benedict amassed quite a reputation. He made some statements that would be considered relatively very conservative today. He was responsible for the motu proprio Summorum Pontificum, which expanded the availability of using the old rite, as they call it, right, as the extraordinary form. But he was still very much of the Novus Ordo. He wasn't as much hostile and as much an enemy of Catholic tradition as Francis was. There are degrees of modernism. It's not as though one is a modernist lock, stock, and barrel or not a modernist at all. There are those who adhere to modernist principles, and yet they haven't necessarily drawn all of the modernist conclusions yet. There were many priests back at Vatican II who were enthusiastic about the idea and the promises that were made, and they found the ideas kind of energizing, modernist ideas. But when they saw the consequences of these ideas, they saw that they were poison. They were poisonous to the faith. And they retreated from them. And of those, there are not a few who actually returned to Catholic tradition and rejected modernism entirely, despite their initially being enamored of it because of the promises of it, the glitziness of it, as it were. And so we can say of Joseph Ratzinger that he might not have seen the ultimate consequences of modernism as clearly, and when he did see them, he was kind of befuddled by it. He still adhered firmly to the principles of modernism. I don't know that he ever retreated from any of them. But he himself was lamenting that Vatican II just didn't work out the way that they'd expected. It wasn't the great springtime of the church as they predicted. Almost as though he was kind of bewildered that it didn't work out, that the theory of it didn't work out quite as they had planned. So was Ratzinger one of those who wanted to set out to destroy the church? I don't think so. I mean, there are others who may have been motivated by Masonic animosity toward the church, wanting to crush it. But Ratzinger, toward the end seemed to be genuinely puzzled about how things had actually played out and didn't know quite what to do about it. So I don't know that he started out with that ill intention of destroying the church, as we might see in Francis. But I'm only interpreting. I don't know. There are many who would disagree with me on that vehemently, I'm sure. Ratzinger just seems to have been disappointed, shall we say, with the application of what he brought in. It's like almost midwifing this thing at Vatican II and then having it grow up, and you wonder, where did this thing come from? But nonetheless, I mean, he was a radical. He did take part in pagan worship. If Francis brought a Pachamama into worship in the churches of Rome, yes, Ratzinger paved the way for him. John Paul II paved the way for him. They all, let's say, had their role in this multiculturalism. They all had their role to play. When Ratzinger presided over the funeral of John Paul II, wasn't it Ratzinger who gave communion to the head of Taizé, the Protestant leader of the Taizé community, on international television? He gives him Holy Communion with everyone else. Again, these things are typical modernist attacks on the traditional Catholic faith. There's no doubt about it. There are those who say that he was actually very much involved in the corruption, and he may well have been. I have the impression, though, that when one takes a closer look at what was going on and his reaction to what was going on, I think to some extent he was probably demoralized at what was happening and disenchanted somewhat, bewildered by it all. So anyway, there's a lot that could be said about the tenure of Joseph Ratzinger as Benedict XVI in those little less than 8 years. There's an article on LifeSite News, which is, I think, very revealing. It doesn't take a firm stance as I would personally take about the whole thing, but I think it is revealing in showing that Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, was not the great traditionalist or conservative that his admirers now want to make him out to be, but that he was a modernist, and that many of the things even that some of his boosters are trying to make of him are not true, but the opposite is the truth. His writings are not conservative, okay? They have serious flaws in them. Even though he made concessions, you might say, to tradition or traditional practices, that was an exception in his mind. But the real faith of Joseph Ratzinger was Vatican II. We have the admirers of Benedict, even critics of his, because they considered him to be not as radical as they, theologically. But even the critics, they're talking about him as a nice, gentle, kind man. And he might have been a very nice, gentle, kind man. But that doesn't make one a saint in the eyes of the Catholic Church. The heroic sanctity is a supernatural phenomenon, you may call it, and is endorsed by Almighty God through it used to be by 4 absolutely undeniable miracles and a long, hard look at a person's life to see if everything was in accord with the faith, because they would not want to hold up anybody as an example of sanctity who, had some serious character flaws. It's now generally conceded, actually, that the man that Benedict XVI chose to be his secretary was an active homosexual. As I say, this is not even disputed anymore, as far as I know. It's hard to imagine that Rome itself would know this, and yet he would not, that Benedict would not have known this, except for some enormous naivete, which he was not, I don't think. There are red flags, certainly. He has an enormous responsibility. As Catholics, we want souls to be saved, and we certainly pray for him. But there were hundreds of millions of Catholic people around the world who were looking to him as the paragon of faith for them and to lead the way for faith. And certainly the legacy that he left them was not that. It was modernism.